Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. On behalf of the Liverpool Medical Institution and the Faculty of Health and Life Sciences at the University of Liverpool, I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening. We're honoured by the presence of Professor Martin Gorsky, who will deliver the 50th Henry Cohen History of Medicine lecture. And his title is Decolonising Global Health, What Can History Contribute? But before introducing Professor Gorsky, it's traditional to say a few words about Henry Cohen. And Henry is the chap in the top of those two portraits in the middle there, in case you don't recognise him. And indeed, this lecture series, as I think lots of you will be aware, was instigated by Lord Cohen himself. And he delivered the first History of Medicine lecture in 1972. Lord Cohen's life was inextricably bound up with the development of the current Liverpool Medical School. He was born in Birkenhead in 1900 and educated at the Birkenhead Institute before coming to the university to study medicine. And he appears to have been an exemplary student. When he graduated in 1922, he'd obtained distinctions in all subjects and all except one of the available prizes, and the medals and the scholarships. At the age of only 34, he succeeded John Hay as Professor of Medicine, a post from which he dominated the medical scene in Liverpool for the next 30 years. Henry Cohen was well known to be opposed to over-specialisation. It was as a general physician that he became widely recognised as one of the most outstanding diagnosticians in the country, and that was undoubtedly aided by a phenomenal memory. He was also a stimulating teacher, and he cultivated a series of highly accomplished academic physicians here in Liverpool, and his reader for many years and his successor was Professor Sir Cyril Clarke, and it was to him and Lord Cohen that we owe our medical genetics unit here at the university. One of the greatest legacies of Henry Cohen was undoubtedly his significant advisory role in the National Health Service after it was formed in 1948. And he advised ministers of health and he chaired the Central Health Services Council. He was knighted in 1949, elevated to the House of Lords as Baron Cohen of Birkenhead in 1956, and made a Companion of Honour in 1974. Cohen served as President of the British Medical Association, President of the Royal Society of Medicine, and of the General Medical Council, and he was also Chancellor of Hull University from 1970 to his death in 1977. Since the first Henry Cohen History of Medicine lecture, we've been honoured to receive a succession of eminent speakers. And I would now like to introduce the latest in this line, Professor Martin Gorsky. Martin's Professor of History at the Centre for the History in Public Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. His research area is the modern history of health systems, public health and policy, and it currently centres on a Wellcome Trust Senior Investigator Award, which has examined the planning and systems analysis in international health between 1920 and 2010. Martin also leads projects on colonial history, particularly of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and on the history of charitable hospital funding and the NHS. And he's had recent books on public health and history with his colleagues Virginia Berridge and Alex Mould, and on the political economy of the hospital in history with Geronia Pons and Margarita Villas Rodriguez. So please join me in welcoming Martin to deliver the 50th Henry Cohen History of Medicine lecture.
Well, good evening, everyone. It really is a great honour to be delivering this year's Cohen lecture. And I also want to say at the beginning, just before I start, that I'm speaking tonight for two wonderful colleagues as well, Becky Martin, and particularly Leoba Hirsch, whose work I'm going to be drawing on in the central part of my talk. Now, if you are an avid reader of The Lancet or the British Medical Journal, or if, like me, you work in a medical school with a large number of international students, you can't have missed the debate and discussion over the last 10 years or so on the subject of decolonising global health. It's a term which is inherently historical. Formal decolonisation took place roughly between 1948 and 1990, with a kind of high point in the 1960s, the ending of the era of the European empires. However, the use of the term that I'm alluding to is much broader than that, and essentially is trying to get at the ways in which the legacies of that history have shaped an ongoing inequality between the rich and the poor world in terms of access to healthcare and health outcomes. And that's really what I want to talk about tonight. And as Sally hinted, I'm going to be focusing my talk on institutions, and particularly the academy, but I hope that there'll be some larger reflections that we can draw from that. So let's begin. There's going to be three parts to my talk. I'll begin with some scene setting. How have we arrived at the decolonising global health moment? And then the central part will be looking at the efforts of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine to address its own colonial past. And then in the final section, I'm going to look at some implications and what that means for the sort of programmes that we might put in place in training medical students for the future of the global health professions. So as I say, the starting point is really an awareness of the gross inequalities, not simply of health, but also wealth in the world today. Here's a famous visualisation, which I'm sure some of you will have seen, by Hans Rosling, a sort of multi-dimensional picture of that disparity. On the y-axis, life expectation, the measure of health, and on the x-axis, GMP, wealth, with the different countries of the world distributed according to size and colour-coded to show you what continents of the world they come from. And this just emphasises the disparities between the fortunate European, Australasian, North American countries, and then down at the far end, various countries from sub-Saharan Africa, who are substantially behind in these measures of population health and of prosperity. More recently, the arguments have centred around the COVID crisis and the distribution of health services, particularly the vaccine, another example of inequality in global health in the world today. There are many ways in which we might explain this, the fortunes and misfortunes of environment and resources, perhaps the nature of political institutions. But the point of the decolonial critique is to argue that this is rooted in history. And indeed, if we scroll back Rosling's visualisation over 200 years, we can see that actually those disparities were already beginning as the age of empire got underway. And the difference, the West pulling away, the great divergence between the West and the rest, could be attributed, yes, of course, to domestic industrialisation, but also to the beginning of globalisation, global trade, global markets, plantation goods produced much under the conditions of slavery. And then if we were to advance forward another 100 years to come to the zenith of the European empires, we could make an argument that that extension of the inequalities, where the West has now really markedly pulled away in terms of both health and prosperity, again is rooted in that advantage of imperialism. The period of the scramble for Africa, when mineral resources and agricultural products like coffee or cocoa or rubber, as you can see here, were being produced in colonial settings and shipped back to the metropolitan centre to fuel industry, services, the finance sector, and so on. And as with economic imperialism, so too with cultural imperialism. This was a period when, under empire, Western values, Western science, Western knowledge were generalised and universalised. And part of that story is the history of Western medicine, biomedicine, or tropical medicine. And it may seem perhaps a difficult idea to grasp that the globalisation of tropical medicine might not have been an unalloyed good for the world, but historians of tropical medicine under empire have developed various critical readings which they make. So, for example, it's pretty clear that initially Western medicine was applied not generally to all imperial subjects, but to the enclave of the white settlers. And when it did move beyond the enclave, it was really in the interests of supporting the imperial economy that it worked. There are arguments too about the way particularly Africa was used as a sort of living laboratory in which some pretty unethical approaches to experimentation and trials went on. There are arguments too about how racial concepts, racial hierarchy concepts, shaped the marginalisation of traditional medicines and the notion that only Western medicine had the answers. And even missionary medicine has been critiqued for its sort of white saviour complex and for its use of medicine as a way of proselytising and of legitimising empire. So those are some of the arguments advanced from the historical perspective of the decolonial critique. And probably when people discuss what they would like to see in terms of decolonising global health, they will all have some sort of different compound of those different arguments in mind. One thing we use in our teaching on the Diploma of Tropical Nursing is a very good filmed discussion of a group of nurses and midwives from Africa and different Asian settings, simply reflecting on what they would like to see in terms of decolonising global health and the health professions today. And the sort of things they come up with are to do with representation, to do with replacing the dominance of the global north with a more bottom-up and indeed even a more community-based focus in terms of leadership. In terms of teaching and training, moving away from a very Eurocentric curriculum and textbooks, which perhaps are not culturally appropriate everywhere. And then some of these more difficult issues, such as the brain drain from poor countries to the prosperous Western health systems. And finally, that difficult question of reparation and restitution for the past imperial exploitation. So if those are some of the sort of broad issues within the profession, let me turn now to the academy. And I think the decolonising movement in the university really begins about 10 years ago in South Africa at the University of Cape Town with the Rhodes Must Fall movement, where the statue of the coloniser Cecil Rhodes became a great symbol for a whole set of other issues about the way that university ran and the discontents of students about it. Discontents about the nature of access, about how staffing was unrepresentative, a Eurocentric curriculum, and so on and so forth. Rhodes did fall in South Africa. The statue was taken down. The movement then picked up in Britain at Oriel College in Oxford, where again the statue manifested a set of other concerns and grievances which student activists in the Rhodes Must Fall group articulated. And their basic argument was that current policies under the sort of equality, diversity and inclusion rubric were too soft and too weak to really achieve anything, and a much more root and branch address of the nature of the academy was really what was called for. In Britain, Rhodes was not taken down, an approach of sort of retain and explain with a plaque being erected was the outcome of that conflict. Partly, I think what we're looking at in the academy is a generational shift amongst students, and certainly the Oxford Rhodes Must Fall group articulated their own position very much in those terms. They're, as part of a global movement of anti-racist student resistance, a generation of self-realised young people of colour who are now, not going to put up with things that others had before. And I think, too, we can see this as partly reflecting the internationalisation and globalisation of the university, the real diversity of students that we now have. Another important trend flowing into all this comes from North America and the efforts of universities there to grapple with their past and the legacies of slavery. That may be literal legacies, in other words, money received from people who had made their fortunes from slave plantations or the slave trade, or it might simply be issues of employment or the use of the Jim Crow laws in those settings and things like that. And many, many places went about it. The Brown University reports slavery and justice is regarded as a real sort of touchstone and exemplar. Lots of examples similarly in Canada. Most of the restitution that's made has come in the form of research money for relevant activities. But a couple of institutions, 2 theological seminaries, have actually made some financial redress. And on this side of the Atlantic, similar projects have been underway. The University of Glasgow also looked at its inheritance of slavery and endowments from that money from those sources, and took restitution in the form of an agreement with the University of the West Indies to fund some partnerships. The University of Cambridge has also been looking at their financial past. In the cognate area, University College London explored the role of eugenics research and teaching, looked into the work of those statistical pioneers like Galton and Pearson, and found some very nasty racist beliefs expressed coming from their eugenics thought. And that was followed by renamings, public apologies, and things like that. Again, the British scene has been also sort of manifesting student activism, pushing this forward. So with all these things going on, the senior leadership of the London School decided in 2018 that they would commission a similar report to explore the colonial history of the school. Once that was actually commissioned, various other things started happening at my institution, which really lent momentum to this debate. A brilliant colleague, Michelle Khan, published an article in The Lancet which just explored empirically the state within the profession of public health schools, public health teaching, of people from ethnic minorities and indeed of gender, and just showed in the clearest possible terms the disadvantage which ethnic minority staff had in terms of promotions, etc. Another colleague, Ngozi Arondu, blogged about her feelings, having been involved in the school in various fieldwork trips with African partners, about how uneven and how unbalanced those experiences had been, and her feeling of being a sort of token person mediating on those research trips. Our director, Peter Piot, who had been the director of UNAIDS before he came to the school, also came in for criticism when he wrote his biography. And he writes there about his role in the discovery of Ebola. And the criticism was that he had neglected to properly acknowledge the role of the Congolese doctor, Jean-Jacques Muyembe, actually in situ, the man who drew the blood from those early deceased patients, which Piot then was able to examine back in Belgium. And what all this led to was a sort of grassroots movements at the school from students and staff to try and push forward the decolonising global health agenda. And then in 2020 came the Black Lives Movement, which lent a further fillip, it gave a further push towards the politics of this moment. Many of you, I'm sure, will remember those scenes of the Colston statue, the Bristol philanthropist and slaver being toppled into the floating harbour, and the demonstrations in the wake of the George Floyd shooting. At the school, that certainly again galvanised a lot of political expression from staff and students towards the institution, wanting to express in the strongest possible terms their concern that actually the colonial legacies and inherent institutional racism were still there. And as part of that call, they wanted to look in more detail and with more care at the colonial history of the school and what that leaves us with. Okay, so that's the end of my first section, where I've been trying to bring into view the sort of issues bubbling around in the larger decolonising global health debate, and then more specifically the implications for medical schools and for schools of public health, with my own institution as the, if you like, the case study. So now I want to move on to the second part, where I'm going to briefly describe the nature of the report and the findings. My role on this was really as a kind of supervisor, shepherding the process along. The key person, though, as I've mentioned, was Lioba, who was the key researcher and author. The remit we were given was a critical interrogation and exploration of the LSHTM's colonial entanglements in the, if you like, the last phase, the early 20th century, the last phase of empire, to think about the consequences of that for the school, and more specifically just to go empirically into issues of funding, the way the school was governed, the nature of teaching, research, partnerships, and so on and so forth, just to essentially get the facts out, if you like. The way we structured it, you can see here. These are the different sections, chapters, so to speak, and I'm just going to say a little bit about the kind of findings that we made under each of these headings. So the first task was really to look at the foundation of the school and its initial links to the colonial office. The school's founder is Patrick Manson, one of the extraordinary pioneers of tropical medicine, and he had a very characteristic medical career in empire. He was a Scot, a lad of parts who successfully trained, but he lacked the connections to get himself a good hospital appointment in London or Edinburgh or Glasgow, and thus decided to make his way, carve out his career in the empire. And he did so, first of all, in part of Britain's informal empire, the Chinese coast, and he arrived in the port city of what was then known as Amoy, where he initially took up expat life, although working as a medical officer, but quickly tired of the hunting and shooting and got more interested in thinking about some of the diseases around that he was dealing with. And he particularly focused on one that was then called elephantiasis, now filariasis. It's a lymphatic disease caused by a parasitic nematode worm of the Filaria family, and it leads to very painful and unpleasant, disfiguring swelling of limbs and organs. Manson initially was interested in surgical approaches to this, but in the 1870s began to reflect on what the etiology could be and what he could do, bringing to bear the new techniques of microscopy, and thought about tropical medicine to get at the etiology. And he began to hypothesize that actually a suctural insect might be the vector by which the parasite was introduced into the human bloodstream. This painting depicts the crucial experiment he conducted to validate his hypothesis. He took one of his domestic servants, his gardener actually, a man called Hin Lo, who was infected already with filariasis, and he had him sleep in a, as you can see here, a sort of canopy, a sealed canopy, into which he released mosquitoes, and the next morning he disabled them with smoke and examined then the contents of their stomach, and was able to thus establish that in fact his hypothesis was correct. And the importance of establishing the mosquito vector for filariasis was perhaps quite minor. It is not a significant disease in terms of incidence, but it was the key step on the road to discovering the mosquito vector for malaria. Just while we're on this picture, note that a critique could be advanced of this representation as a characteristic case of cultural imperialism, with the Westerner, the white saviour, standing in the centre, gleaming white, representing the power of Western science, and looming above his Chinese servants who kind of stooped or prone beneath him. Now, Manson had hoped that he would enjoy an early and comfortable retirement, but he made some bad investments and was forced in later life to come back to London and to work for a living. And he took up a job based on his new status as a scientist in tropical medicine at the Colonial Office, where he was in charge of the medical officers who went out to work in the British Empire, in charge of inspecting them, vetting them, and so on. He was clearly an accomplished wheeler-dealer in extracting funds, and was able to persuade the Colonial Office to put up some money to begin medical teaching, first of all in the Hospital of Tropical Diseases in the London Docks, and then when that hospital moved to Bloomsbury, to have a medical school there. And it was in that context that the London School of Tropical Medicine began. You can see here in the bottom there, Manson leaning over, looking at the first year, the first cohort of men and women who were trained at the school. And we've been able to sort of pull out some of the texts of his writing and his speeches, and it's very clear that he frames the purpose of the school in terms of being an influence for good in the development of empire. There's a really telling speech he makes at a dinner in 1912, where he talks about the contribution of tropical medicine training being an economic one, supporting the government in its efforts to govern and exploit, or rather develop, a poor, unhealthy country. So the colonial project was very much entwined with the school at its birth. And it's important to say that the focus was not, as it is in our motto today, to improve public health worldwide. Rather, the initial focus was very much on the health of the colonisers. Here's the Secretary for the Colonial Office, Joseph Chamberlain, trying to elicit some funds from John Bull, who is the characteristic figure representing the British public. And you can see that the basis of that appeal is to protect the health of the planter. There he is on his veranda, in Africa perhaps, or in Asia, somewhere with his gin and tonic at his side, and above him are hovering the tsetse fly and the Aedes aegypti mosquito. So the colonial project at the heart of the school's foundation. We followed that through with some empirical work to look at who the early students were, and we indeed discovered that there was a very large group of people who were studying to go out, either to come from or to go out to positions in the colonies. Quite a large chunk of people going to work as medical missionaries. And in terms of the geography, we have data on that as well. And again, 2/3 of people going out to places in the British Empire or in other imperial settings. Right from the start, the school was international, and it was interesting to learn about the earliest students of colour. But they were people who were very much going out, again, into imperial networks to imperial posts. Herbert Tobit, first of all, somebody who went out to work in the Gold Coast, in Ghana, supporting the British military as a medical officer. W.E. Lewis and McCormack Eastman in the centre, again people who went out to work in the colonial medical service. The Sierra Leonean Eastman, whose family are now very eminent surgeons over there, was actually up against a colour bar in the West African medical service, which meant he couldn't serve as a full qualified doctor, but only a so-called native medical officer. The Gore sisters at the other end, two students from India, funded by philanthropy, the Dufferin Fund, which was a British aristocrat who wanted to support the development of maternity hospitals, the Zenana in India. And we've been able to trace the Gore sisters' subsequent career working in maternal health. We also looked at the school's governance structures to ask whether the committees who ran the school and set policy were also integrated with the colonial project. And certainly we find plenty of representatives of different London University colleges, of medical schools, and institutions that you might expect, the Medical Research Council, the British Medical Association, and so on and so forth. But right through the period, we also found that the services, Army, Navy, and Air Force, are represented, as well as the Colonial Office, Secretary of State for India, and so on. And in the co-opted members of the board, we find, again, running through the whole period, people with strong colonial business interests. Here's a couple of them: Alfred Mond, the chair of ICI, Chet Beatty, an American mining magnate with interests really throughout sub-Saharan Africa. So the colonial interest and indeed military interests of the state very much represented. Here are the different buildings of the school. First of all at the London Docks, then the Hospital of Tropical Diseases in Bloomsbury, and finally its Keppel Street site, where it still is today. And this is where the early work of training colonial medical officers and indeed nurses was taking place. Thinking about getting at the development of research and teaching, we can track the different appointments and learn that actually most of what was going on is very much lab-based and clinical training for working particularly with diseases with insect vectors or parasitic diseases, plus epidemiology. The only course we found in the teaching programme that really looks as though it represented eugenics and some clear ideas about white superiority grounded in racism was the so-called racial hygiene course. It was only taught quite briefly. We haven't been able to find out a huge amount about it, but even from the brief syllabus we can see that tropes like primitive and native are being used. So we can get the sense that the kind of proto-anthropology which is being taught here was definitely imbued with notions of racial hierarchy. And we know also that one of the teachers on it, L.G. Malcolm, was renowned as a eugenicist working in Australia who specialised in craniology, the measurement of skulls and deductions about that for relative intelligence of Aboriginal Australians. So clearly there is some evidence, although it's rather sort of circular, of racist ideas filtering into the teaching. We're able to know a lot more about the nature of the research projects that the school undertook and talk about the ways that linked in with the political economy of empire, much as Manson had said it should do in those early talks, and we've been able to track the nature of the early grants, who held them, how much they were for, and whereabouts the work took place. And rather than going through all these, perhaps just to cut to the chase and sort of get to the main point, which is that many early research projects were tied, both in terms of place to the British Empire, but also in terms of the economic objectives of colonialism. This is manifested in this cartoon here. That shows Ronald Ross, who of course was at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine early in his career. But the Ross Institute in 1934 became part of the London School, and we're seeing this image here representing the idea that tropical medicine is going to be key to actually improving the economic development. And there's Ross with his fulcrum, his lever, trying to lift the burden of malaria away from imperial industries, cocoa, cotton, sugar, tea, coffee. You can see them sort of all around. And we've also found plenty of textual evidence that the school really used this argument to elicit funds both from the Colonial Office and from colonial governments in situ. Letters like this one you can see here, which itemise the work of the school in various African settings, cleaning up malaria in one of the early mines, somebody working on infrastructure, on bridge building and railways in Nyasaland, malaria in Cecil estates, blackwater fever, tea growing, and so on and so forth. So again, this idea of research being very much entwined with the interests of the imperial economy. It's been a lot more difficult to get at the question of how much colonial attitudes, notions of racial hierarchy and racial superiority were really there in the teaching and the general atmosphere of the school. The only way we've really been able to do that is by sort of picking some individuals and trying to do case studies which help us sort of elicit their views. Start with Andrew Balfour. He was the school's first director when it amalgamated with the School of Public Health and became Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. But before that, it had a stellar career in medicine, working with the Wellcome. And in some of his writings, we've been able to find some notions of difference, some othering of Africans, particularly talking about health behaviours and the risk that led to. The often disgusting, not infrequently dangerous habits of the native servant, posing a risk to imperial expats or settlers. Balfour was also a novelist, a purveyor of fiction in the sort of ripping yarns mode of Rider Haggard and King Solomon's Mines. And again, we've dipped into some of this to see if that can give us any glimmers of his attitudes. Of course, you can't read off anything very directly from what's written in fiction. But for example, in paragraph 2 there, he's talking about his hero, Henry Mortimer, reflecting on the humanity of African slaves. And while he submits that he is a fellow mortal, he also notes that he is low in the human scale and to be kept in subjection. So whether that is a genuine reflection of his view, we don't know, but he certainly felt at liberty to express that in his novel. Here's another character, Cecil Cook, more briefly at the school, where again he had a very distinguished career and used his scholarship to do some breakthrough work on leprosy. And then went off to become the Chief Protector of Aboriginal Affairs in the Northern Territory of Australia. And Australian scholars who work on the history of public health have settled on his work as something very key to showing how racist ideologies permeated early notions of public health in Australia. And again, we find this similar tarnishing of the Australian Aboriginal for their behaviours. Someone who is careless and irresponsible unless he's under restraint, and so on and so forth. And eugenic ideas also run through Cook's thinking. And he was, his view was that what he called the problem of our half-castes was something which would ultimately be be addressed as people intermarried or had relationships, and essentially the black race would disappear and be submerged. So here are some of the things that we've been able to find to give us a sense of the atmosphere. Coming slightly later to the 1930s, a much more difficult case I always find is that of Cicely Williams, who in all other respects was absolutely a pioneer as a woman in medicine, a woman in tropical medicine, and someone who broke all the glass ceilings that confronted her in that period. And her first real claim to fame was the person who identified the nutritional disease kwashiorkor and wrote the early papers about that. She later goes on to work in the WHO, leading the organisation's maternal and child health section. But in some Lancet articles where she's presenting the results of her findings on kwashiorkor and reflecting on the relationship between health behaviours and nutrition, she has some pretty offensive things to say, as we would now see it. I won't read them all out, but look at what she's saying about the mentality of the African compared to the white races, a childlike gift, invariably dishonest, lack of initiative, and on and on and on. And what can we think about this? What can we think of the fact that the Lancet, which is now the great champion of decolonising global health, thought nothing of publishing this sort of material? It simply tells us just how common these kind of discourses, this sort of culture within the habitus within which such people worked actually was. Coming towards the end of empire now, and the mid and later 20th century, how does the school adapt? Our view is that these arguments about racial difference certainly disappear, or at least are moderated as tropical medicine shifts from the imperial to the development era. But the presentation of the school's role very much retains the paternalistic and hierarchical notions of the colonial era. Africans represented visually here actually as very much the sort of needy and supplicant people to whom those at the London school will convey the benefits of their knowledge. And the material representation of the building, the parent school, winding down its teaching, training through different settings in the field, in the clinic, to the daughter school in the now post-colonial setting. We've run out of money to take this project on further into the post-1960s era, but we have done a little bit of work. One of the things we've discovered taking our student origins analysis on is that the school very much continued to take its student body from those countries which had originally been in the British Empire, or indeed of the empires of other countries. And in terms of percentage, it looks as though about 45%, something like that, came from such areas. The figures on origin become more opaque as we get past the 1990s, but we can still say that broadly international students hovering between 40 and 50% of the student body, and a large chunk of them still people from settings which had originally been in the empire. So some continuity there. So sort of finishing off really, as we get to the end of the colonial era in the school's history, it's now refashioning itself as a global institution, refashioning itself for the development era, but the concept is still very much that the heart of the metropolitan centre is where it's at. It's still retaining this sort of core to periphery differentiation rooted in the era of empire. And so the sort of headline conclusions that Lioba drew out of the colonial history reports, here they are, and I think they flow from the empirical findings that she made, that the school did directly benefit from the exploitation of colonial subjects, that its research and teaching was indeed to support the colonial endeavour, and that we have some evidence, at least, that the staff at the school were propagating ideas of racial hierarchy. Okay, that brings me to the end of my second section, and I'll now just head towards the close with some reflections really on the fallout, how the institution has addressed what we found in the debates that we've subsequently had, and to think a bit more about what institutions could and should be doing to carry forward this debate, at least from a historical perspective. We had a wonderful advisory group. Here are some of the people here with some very esteemed figures who suggested the way we should sort of go about launching the report, getting it out as far as possible to as many staff as we could, and then having whole staff meetings at which we could, through different techniques, talk about the implication and try to find some consensus as to ways forward. I think it's fair to say that there were really two types of response among staff and indeed students. All welcomed the report and thought it was well worth doing and should form the basis of discussion as the school thinks about how to refashion itself as a global institution for today. But I think some people took what we might call a more centrist response, arguing that the critique should not outweigh the achievement and all the good that the school had done throughout its long life. And others felt that there should be an avoidance of the sort of symbolic or sort of gestural responses, such as the politics of apology. But I would also want to delineate what we might call a more radical response from those who felt that this really was an important call to action, and action needed to be taken more urgently, and the sort of things they highlighted, which they saw as ongoing legacies of the things that we had found, matters like the continuing Eurocentricity of the curriculum, the inequalities of research partnerships in lower income countries, the ongoing inequities faced by staff and students of colour, including their experience of racism within the institution. So what came out of the discussions, and this I should say was also aided by a parallel report into racism at the institution, was a series of moves with the aim of developing a programme which would fit us for the era of decolonising public health. Part of that, I suppose, is quite familiar sort of human resources activity in any such institution under the banner these days of equality, diversity and inclusion, but to try to give it real teeth and real substance through key appointments, through putting into place protocols and structures which would deal quickly and effectively with any racist incidents that occurred, and so on and so forth. Of particular importance in an institution like ours was putting in place structures to try to make more equal the research partnerships that we were undertaking. Much more consciousness of that in scientific review of applications before they went forward, trying to work into the ethics approval process, obligations to actually consult and partner and co-produce pieces of research, strategies like that. And finally, the decolonising of the curriculum, a conscious effort to really diversify and draw really genuinely globally on teaching materials, the sort of position of authority from which teaching came, a diversity of the kind of settings and case studies that we used in demonstration. And finally, of particularly importance to me and our group of historians, to try to embed some ongoing teaching of colonial history so that we could feed into this debate. So that brings me to the next question for the historians of what should history be contributing? What ought we to do for medical students who, let's face it, are not interested particularly, as a whole body at least, in history? They certainly come to an institution like the London School, not for the humanities and social sciences, but really for the vocational training in epidemiology or medical stats or healthcare evaluation that they are going to need when they go back into the field and into their professional lives. So the challenge was to create some sort of course which could, just in sort of small bite-size sections, attract people who wanted to learn more about this and give them some steer about where they might go for further reading and developing their ideas. We weren't able to embed this in the curriculum, but we were able to make it very present as a sort of voluntary extra, and of course in the post-Zoom era to make it available as an online course, which is kind of there now for people to dip into. So this is what it contained. First of all, a sort of grounding for the novice, I guess, in empire, definitions, concepts, terminology, and an introduction to those ideas of economic and cultural imperialism, which are at the centre of the decolonial critique. And then to do some overview teaching about the history of tropical medicine, and bring out some of those critical ideas that I mentioned at the start of the lecture about the way tropical medicine interknit with the interests of empire, as well, of course, as all the achievements that it made. And then to prime people with a little bit of detail about how medicine worked in the later era of colonialism as we move into the era of development and what its place was within that. And finally, in the post-colonial period, to talk about the new architecture of public health, WHO, UNICEF, World Bank, all the different philanthropies which crowd the field nowadays. And just to ask whether post-colonial independence did genuinely lead to a democratic, multilateral form of decision-making in global health, or whether in fact power has continued to reside in many ways with the West. And then in the final sections we bring it back home, so to speak, by looking at the experience and inequalities of ethnic minorities in the prosperous West, taking the UK, the US and New Zealand as our examples, and then close with a discussion session on how colonial legacies can be confronted and resolved. We take New Zealand, which is a particularly interesting case of biculturalism and efforts to provide restitution to the Maori people through some specific policies, some of them concerned particularly with health. So, just to sort of head to a conclusion, the question of the lecture was what can history contribute, and I think the account I've given of our activities at the school show that it can contribute to, first of all, institutional reflection, and also by presenting material which will allow individuals to carry forward their own personal thoughts. And I've stressed the way that what we've been trying to do as historians is to introduce the decolonial critique, the decolonial perspective into the school, and to sort of talk about how these notions of economic and cultural imperialism play out in the context of medicine. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this is history that undergirds a progressive agenda in quite a self-conscious way. It's history, if you like, with a mission. It's history as a kind of activism. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. History throughout, certainly throughout the 20th century, has always been yoked to different causes. And I suspect that there are few historians practicing today, including people in this room who work on the history of the NHS, who would honestly claim that their own personal positions and beliefs don't influence the history that they teach and deliver. But I just want to end the lecture with a sort of contradiction or provocation, if you like, and a reflection more broadly on the role of history and empire that I've been talking about. Because history does claim to be a social science, it does claim to proceed through the presentation of verifiable empirical evidence, and to make its case by advancing the most plausible analysis which can explain change and causation. And I think it's worth saying that for me, as a historian working in this field, the more I work on it, the less certain I become of the grounds of argumentation. And I'll just mention a couple of the things which have troubled me and caused me to reflect on the way that the decolonial narrative of this history could be problematized. Let me start with a quote from Yuval Noah Harari from his book Sapiens, which is a cross-millennia, really long-term vision of the history of humanity. And he makes what is perhaps a rather obvious point, that empire is and has been, and probably will be, simply part of the human condition. It's been the world's most common form of political organisation for the last 2,500 years. Most humans during those 2.5 millennia have lived in empires. And what he argues is that if we strip out the sort of good and evil perspectives, the arguments about what empire contributed and the horrors, the violence, the brutality that it also involved, what the long beam of history seems to show is that empire is always a force for integration and, if you like, the consolidation of the different elements of the human race. That integration might take the form of the use of common languages, the use of number systems, the use of money as a mode of exchange, syncretism, the melding of cultures in areas like food and music and so on, and finally, of course, of healing systems. It's simply what empires do. Coming to some more specific elements of the decolonial narrative, the decolonial history that I've put before you, I wouldn't be doing my duty as a historian if I wasn't pointing out how controversial many of the planks of that history are. Economic historians debate long and hard whether the Great Divergence really did hinge critically on the plantation economies and the money that flowed to the West. And there are other candidates, including culture, religion, institutions, and more sort of fine-grained macroeconomic arguments about things like the relative cost of labour. The question of the abolition of slavery is also certainly one which is highly controversial. Was it simply because Western capitalism no longer needed this form of labour? Or how much shall we attribute to the abolition movement, that great movement of human rights, which did combine both black and white individuals, but with many ideas that were grounded in the Western Enlightenment? There is a debate about whether colonialism was a net loss or a benefit to Britain in the early years of the welfare state. It doesn't seem to me to be resolved. And what about the question of the scientific revolution in which the great leaps forward in Western biomedicine occurred? How do we sort of balance the arguments about the relative importance of the different sciences and technological practices of all different parts of the world with the notion that there was something different and peculiar about what occurred in the Western Enlightenment? And all this, I think, sort of pushing towards or away from a kind of simplistic view of this history as one of victims and villains. And finally, for those of us who work in medical institutions, which nominally at least are committed to the scientific method and principles on which biomedicine has been based for the last 200 years, how do we sort of reconcile that with the scepticism towards Western knowledge as universal, which comes out of the decolonial critique? So I'll just leave you with some of those provocations, contradictions involved in doing this kind of history. And just close by saying that hopefully I've answered part of the question that I posed about how history can feed into an institution's reflections on how to come to terms with the colonial legacy in global health today. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Martin, thank you very much. It's a difficult but an absolutely necessary topic, and it's really good to see the way that the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine has made advances in that area, and we are on a similar path here in Liverpool with our institutions as well. So I know you're happy to take questions, so I will open it up for questions at this point. Yes. If you can raise your voice as much as you can, please, as we haven't got a microphone.
I was just thinking about how, so we know that most global disease and disability has its roots in poverty. And we know that most former colonial countries are in poverty still, mostly due to things like decline of welfare payments and being exploited still by the global north. Like Jason Hinkle tells us that for every dollar moving from north to south, it's $14 moves back from various exploitative regions. As if we're recognising and acknowledging the colonial attitudes of our institutions in the past and their role in this, what sort of role do you think that our institutions have in sort of lobbying for changes in this power dynamic?
I think they have a really important one, but it's very depressing to reflect on what's just happened in the last few years. The London School, certainly 10 or 15 years ago, did a great deal of work which was funded by DFID, the Department for International Development, and that was actually one of the bases through which we could try and develop and improve the question of unequal partnerships. But as people will probably know, that funding was suddenly and precipitously withdrawn by the, I can't remember which, was it no, it wasn't the Cameron government, I think it was either May or Johnson. So we seem to be going backwards. But I mean, from the perspective of a training institution, what we can do is sort of elevate the consciousness of our students, and perhaps to sort of come to the particular area that you've raised, I would be more interested, I think, in talking about the role of institutions like the World Bank since the 1980s, and the way in which episodes like the effort to introduce user fees in the 1980s led to a kind of stalling of the extension of access and things like that. I mean, we can't change the world, but we can just fight the good fight and do our bit with the amount of influence that we can exert in our roles.
We had a question over here.
Given that a lot of colonial subjects were subject to some unethical medical testing, and the legacy of that today is a collective distrust of Western medicine and Western medical institutions, is there anything that institutions globally or domestically as a former colonial country in Britain can do to help, essentially? Because I myself as a Jamaican, in the pandemic, there are many people very sceptical of Western medicine, and I think that's a direct result of the way that some of the colonial subjects were treated by the medical institutions at that time.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, another great example of that was in the recent Ebola crisis in West Africa, where there was a lot of concern with these sort of white-suited, hazmat-suited UN representatives and the military who suddenly appeared and were sort of trying to direct people around and intercede with their cultural burial practices and so on and so forth. I mean, what I was saying, again, this is a sort of small effort to kind of push things forward, is simply to make sure that the research projects and field work that we're engaged in try to do the best they can to work with people rather than sort of vertically parachute in and do things to or for people. And I was mentioning, for example, the idea of the ethics process, trying to sort of build in a requirement to try to co-produce, to involve people as partners in the way that trials are designed and set up, or that surveys are articulated and things like that. And I think that's one way we can sort of edge forward as a training institution in helping address those problems you bring up.
Yes.
I just have a comment rather than a question, which is just, I'm part of a grant with Pakistan for improving the care for the patients. A big grant from the NIHR, 3.4 million. It's the first NIHR grant where the lead partner is the one from the low income setting and not from the Western partner, and that is in 2024. When you're talking about the encouragement of research and development, we still have that distrust about, or prejudice about how money is managed.
That's a really helpful comment, and it's, I suppose, good to know that things are at least beginning to shift.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I wonder if you could tell us the extent to which, in your forward history work, you collaborate with African departments of history.
The answer is a little bit. I mean, I'm somebody personally who came out of working on the National Health Service, and in my health systems project, I have two collaborations. One with a group called IFRA, which is a research institute at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, which happens to be the place really crucial to the holding of the archives. And I have another collaboration with the University of Rosario in Bogota, Colombia being particularly interesting for health systems history as a kind of pioneer of some forms of primary and community care. The one thing I would say is that funders, particularly the Wellcome Trust, which is so crucial to the history of medicine, have really in the last 10 or 20 years begun to really put some effort behind developing those sorts of research partnerships. It was actually work with University in Shanghai, which very much sort of blazed the trail and looked at sort of some of the ways that we could take that forward. And there are other funding opportunities that do come forward. I've been involved in a fascinating effort at the end of last year where we pooled some funding with three groups of researchers in Britain and Norway, and put on an extensive witness seminar for retired African health leaders to come and speak. It's a sort of, so to speak, a kind of group oral history exercise. And we gathered a lot of individuals, some of whom have been very significant, not just in their own countries, but in WHO Afro or the World Bank, and sat them down in a peaceful setting for a series of days and conducted a series of interviews which we've recorded and transcribed to search for their memories and their perspectives on essentially the development of issues like health planning, training in tropical diseases, the advance of universal health coverage and things like that in the post-colonial period. So there's some very interesting work underway, and my sense is, looking at the sort of postdocs that are getting funded, is that field in history and the history of tropical medicine or global health is something which is really opening up and being made available to people from elsewhere. I don't know, would you concur with that?
I would, Martin.
Yeah.
Yes. I think we will call questions to an end. I know there's a few more hands, but I'm conscious that there are drinks waiting for us upstairs, and I know Martin will be happy to take questions up there as well. So Callum is now going to do a vote of thanks, and then we'll have the formal university dismissal.
Good evening, Dame Sheard, Professor Gorsky, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Liverpool Medical Institution, I'd like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Professor Gorsky for gracing us today with the 50th delivery of the Henry Cohen Lecture. This evening, we've had the privilege delving into the history, and great light has been shed on the colonial history of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Professor Gorsky led us novices through awareness of the health inequalities between the West and the rest. I was very struck by the imagery of the white saviour, Patrick Manson standing in that image. It really was a perfect illustration of that concept. Thank you very much. We then heard action by the London School to understand the colonial attitudes throughout its research and past teachings. Professor Gorsky, we're immensely grateful for the knowledge that you've shared with us today. And once again, on behalf of everyone present here, I extend our sincerest gratitude for your enlightening lecture. Professor Gorsky, would you come forward, please, and accept the Liverpool Medical Institution medal and our thanks, please.
Right.